and lack of health care, lack of dental care, and food insecurity, how that contributes to student development. But all this goes to say that our tests really do not measure what test proponents say they do, both historically and technically. But what is most disheartening is that our current use of high-stakes standardized testing is in blatant disregard of what the research tells us. Now, I want to be clear. We have real problems with educational inequality in this country, and myself and other progressive education researchers and activists continue to work vehemently to improve things. My point here is this: the so-called education reforms being advanced today with a neoliberal orientation and reliance on high-stakes testing simply will not do the job. In closing, let me remind you that the stakes in the struggle are high. Kids and teachers are having not just their systems of education ruined, their lives and their futures are being messed with by all of this nonsense. I start off with these remarks with my anger, and while I usually end my talks with uplift and hopefulness, tonight I really want us to sit with the reality that is the inappropriateness of high-stakes testing. So I'll leave you with one last piece of anger that is sitting with me. I'm heartbroken and furious that South Los Angeles elementary school teacher, Rigoberto Ruelas, committed suicide a couple of weeks ago. Most likely as a response to the LA Times publishing his name and his test-based rating as less than effective. And actually, Dan, I hadn't heard the part about the principal giving him the qualitative rating as very effective. That even makes it worse. So, you know, the Ruelas suicide is just sitting with me very heavily, and I don't want us to let go of that because these things have very real consequences and can be a matter of life and death for kids and teachers. Teachers and students are more than simple numbers, and our tests are not complicated enough to capture learning. The public shame brought on Mr. Ruelas is inexcusable, especially in the face of the inaccuracies of our tests. So, thank you. That's now, Diane, just for the follow-up question, just for the end of the panel, I would just like to know if you could talk about the interplay between the foundations, the big business interests, and this push to use tests to evaluate teachers. So like more detail about the confluence of sort of big business and using tests to evaluate teachers. So, thank you.
You know, I think that what has happened is that most people, whether they're in business or they're members of Congress, don't really think a lot about education. They just kind of get involved in lots of different issues, and they listen to a handful of voices. Right now, there are a handful of voices that are wielding immense power because of their money, and because they have access to very large microphones, much larger than the one that we have tonight. I mean, when Bill Gates puts out hundreds of millions of dollars all over the country, sit up and listen and comply. When Eli Broad has the Superintendent's Academy and trains dozens of superintendents across the country, who then spread out across the country to close public schools and open charter schools, it's almost like a plague across the land. I know that, for instance, in Kansas City, the pro-trained superintendent there has closed half the public schools. In Detroit, the superintendent there, trained by the Broad Academy, has said he wants to create, he's not a superintendent actually, he's the emergency financial manager, but he said he wants to turn Detroit public schools into new GM and old GM. New GM will be the charters and old GM will be the rusting plan. You know, this is really, you know, why has big business gotten so interested? I guess because the American public and the American media find all of these metaphors something that they understand. We like competition. We like winners and losers. The problem is that what we lack is a national voice and a spokesperson who will say the principle of American education is not competition and a race. It's equal educational opportunity. And ranking students, a lot of kids are going to be losers, just as in the race at the top. There are 11 states that were winners in the DC, and 39 states were losers. Well, if education is the civil right, why isn't the Department of Education giving out all it has to give on the basis of need, not competition?
Yeah!
So with that, let's let's move on to the next.
Perfect segue.
Again, and I just wanted to remind everybody that we are handing out cards, and please feel free to put a question on there. If you've already filled out your card, please hand it to the end of the aisle and have people collect those cards and bring them up to me. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane. I want to begin my remarks tonight by relating an episode of my life that occurred recently that I like to call Waiting for Lex Luthor. I went to a special screening of the film, Waiting for Superman, last Thursday night. Somehow I got invited in to participate in this special event, and we were told that the supervillain himself, my arch nemesis, Davis Guggenheim, would be there after the film to take Q&A. So it was a school night. I had a whole lot of papers to grade that I was behind on, but I couldn't pass this up, and I had to wait for this opportunity. And so I saw the movie. I saw every last teacher bashing, union bashing, privatization moment. I sat through that film, and I waited for the lengthy introduction that he got. I waited some more for a couple questions, and I finally was able to get the microphone to ask my question. So I got the microphone. I was handed it, and I said, my name is Jesse Hagopian, and I've taught in a couple of the school districts that you portray in your film. I taught in Washington, D.C. for 3 years, and I taught summer school in the Bronx. So I've seen the problems firsthand that you describe in this film in terms of the challenges that these kids are facing. And this is what I told them. I said, I believe that there is an inconvenient truth that you left out of that film. To his credit, when I said that, he laughed. But you know, I said that every major study that's been done nationally about the solutions you have to the problems that are facing these kids show the exact opposite of what you recommend in this film. And so, you know, I pointed out the Stanford study that shows, you know, charter schools underperforming the public schools. I pointed out the study that just came out that said that merit pay had no effect in improving education. And I asked him, did your stomach turn when that study came out? I mean, you must have been really worried, like, oh no, I got to go back to the editing table and cut out. It's going to cost me a lot of money. We're going to have to recall the film. Was this a big problem? He didn't really respond to that part, so I kept talking. I told him about my experience of charter schools in Washington, D.C. I taught in a public school there, and what would happen in November is that my class would suddenly get 9 new students, right? Where did these kids come from? Well, they were the ones the charters kicked out and didn't want, right? So they come to my class, and my class size grows. But guess what? The per pupil funding, the taxpayer money that went to that private charter school did not follow them. So my class size get bigger and the resources get less. That's how charter schools work in this country, Mr. Guggenheim. I asked him if he had a response to that, and he said, this is what he told me. He says, I don't have an answer for that, but what would you suggest? Which was the perfect thing to ask me. First thing I suggested was curriculum. You have a whole movie about public education, but you don't say a word in this entire film about what the kids are actually learning. Does that not matter at all? What happens? So in Washington, D.C., the kids that I taught there, one of the first assignments I assigned was a show and tell. I asked the kids the first day to go back home and find something meaningful from their house that they could bring in that would tell me about who they were. This was a 6th grade classroom. And so I gave them all small brown paper bags to put their items in and bring to class. And they came to class the next day, and we're in the circle, in the front of the room, and the first kid pulls out a picture of their dad. Their dad was dead. The next kid pulls out a picture of their uncle. Their uncle's in jail. Right? By the third and fourth kid, I didn't know what to do. It was sort of a panic, right? And every single student in the entire class, if you're going to choose an object that tells you about who you are and what's important in your life, they all picked a picture of an uncle or a father that was either incarcerated or dead. Now, to not address the larger social forces in your film is a mistake. To not in this country is a mistake. But if you want to reach those kids, you have to have a curriculum that is anti-racist, that explains how in the shadow of the White House we can be in a school that has a hole in the ceiling in my classroom and it floods the classroom when it rains, right? You have to have a curriculum that can actually teach Black history and empower these students, and you don't have anything about curriculum in your movie, I pointed out. Right? The other thing I pointed out was that I started teaching in 2001, which happened to be the same year that our country launched the war in Afghanistan. And I received a high degree in education that year because I saw in the shadow of the White House, right, we can spend more to go and bomb children halfway around the world. We can come up with that money in the snap of a fingers, but we can't find the money to fix the hole in the ceiling of my classroom. Right? That's what I learned my first year teaching. And then recently that was reinforced for me. When we can find $14 trillion to bail out bankers, right? But we can't find the money to lower class size. We know that there's a problem in this country with education, but none of that was addressed in your film, Mr. Guggenheim. So after going through all of these points with him, he was patient with me. I appreciated it. All Davis could say at the end of that explanation of what would actually improve public schools, he said, well, I'm just not for the status quo. Right? That's the mantra of these corporate education reformers. All they can cling on to is that they're not for the status quo. None of us in this room are for the status quo. We all have a vision for education that's about empowering students, creating civic leadership, right? That's all about creating critical thinkers and bringing the resources to the schools to do that. So that is a red herring that won't work with this group. And so I just want to end by saying one word about my experience in Haiti, because I think it has a couple lessons for this conversation about the ed reform movement. When I was there, I passed by a school that had completely collapsed, and everybody was around screaming around the school, and I somehow convinced myself that nobody in that building had lost their lives. I couldn't bring myself to think about it. Since coming home, I found out that 5,000 schools in Haiti collapsed during that earthquake. And you heard Diane Ravitch talk about what Arnie Duncan said about Hurricane Katrina.